Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be discussing the future of Resident Evil. I'm sure you'll all agree that Resident Evil 6 was one of the most anticipated games of the Xbox 360 and PS3 generation, and I think many would also agree that it didn't really live up to the expectations that we maybe put upon it. The title shifted about 5 million copies, however, Capcom were hoping for an additional 2 million on top of that. And many people would agree that the title had a few issues with it. One of them was the fact that it maybe wasn't as scary as what people hoped, and the other one was that fans felt the game was a bit too bloated. And Capcom have now assured us that this is not going to be the direction of Resident Evil in the future. Resident Evil 7, or whatever it ends up being called, is going to be a lot more down to earth, a lot more down to its original roots, and it's going to be appealing more to the original fans. In other words, those who were around for, say, Resident Evil 3. Michael Pattinson has been speaking, and he is a former Capcom Senior Vice President of Marketing. And he was discussing what Capcom have learnt and how they feel that this is going to impact their future decisions with the game. I'm going to read you guys out some series of quotes, and then we'll do some analysis of it. I think that's pretty fair. We have obviously seen the consumer response and the PR response. There are some great positives out there, but it was a mixed bag, as we saw from review scores. We've got to take that on board, we can't ignore that, and we have to take that onto the next game that we make on the next Resident Evil. With Resident Evil 6 specifically, we probably put too much content in there, and there were comments from the consumers that it felt bloated. The Leon missions went down really well, and because of Resident Evil Revelations on the 3DS, there were cries for us to focus on our attention on survival horror rather than the many things to all people. You'll find where we go next will likely be a target of our core fan base. End quote for now. So, why did Capcom go this route? Why did they try to, put motorcycle racing scenes in there and X, Y, and Z? And the answer, of course, is sales. Because they are making AAA titles. Effectively, the budget for these games, as you all know by now, is, well, let's go with extravagant. And you obviously need to appeal to a wider audience as possible, so that your title sells more copies so you don't end up losing money. The problem with Resident Evil 6, as I discussed, is that for many people, such as myself, who had invested a lot of time in the series, I'd played from the original Resident Evil onwards, and I absolutely loved the first time I stepped foot into the mansion, the original Resident Evil 1 mansion, and I remember running around like an idiot the first time. I was pretty young when I originally played the game. I played it on release, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. It's my first real survival horror title, to be honest. I played the odd, bits here and there, but certainly nothing really up to the standard of like Resident Evil or, say, Silent Hill. And I was running around, and I suddenly realised, I have to take this game really seriously. And all the reviews that had told me, you better not be wasting even handgun ammo, I realised that they were pretty damn true. Because of that, I restarted the game, and when I did, I was really conservative with ammunition. And it actually felt like you didn't want to die, and there were numerous reasons behind this. Now, for those of you who have played the earlier Resident Evil games, even up to something like, say, Code Veronica, you'll be able to follow along pretty easily with this. There are multiple issues with increasing the game's difficulty. One of them was death. Now, I know that's a bit of a stupid thing to say. It sounds stupid anyway, you die and that's a punishment. But the fact of the matter is, it really was in Resident Evil, because dying was completely in your control. In other words, sure, you might not expect, say, a hunter to show up at that specific point in the game, but you could get away from it. You could run through the door, you could go back, you could maybe find some ammo. The fact of the matter is that you could really tell if someone was good at the game, if they knew where the weapons were, the ammo and everything else. But more to the point, you could actually tell if someone knew what they were doing in terms of conserving their ammo and trying to avoid unnecessary confrontations. And even, for example, in the remake, which was appeared on the GameCube, there were a couple of doors which actually would wear out because the handles were really damaged, and so if you kept going backwards and forwards through the door, eventually the handle would literally drop off and you couldn't actually use that door anymore, so you better realise you're going to have to run the long ass way round, which was a pain in the ass, especially if you're trying to complete the game in a certain amount of time so you could unlock more stuff. The other thing, of course, was the fact that there were ink ribbons. It didn't just save your progress, and this compounded the death factor. I've always said one of the concerns I have with games and survival horror, as a general rule, might I add, not just in Resident Evil, is continues. Now, this is a real massive, huge criticism I've actually levelled on Amnesia as well, the original Amnesia. If I feel that if I die, I could die a million times and there is absolutely no punishment, I don't really have to go back that far, my ammunition doesn't dwindle any further, and in addition to all of that, the game doesn't really have a difficult encounter, it's more, or a terrifying encounter, it's more frustrating, then I don't care. I end up just basically thinking, well, if I die, who cares? And this is the thing. There were so many zombies on screen on Resident Evil 6, for example, that it just got to the point where you were just shooting it, it didn't really matter what the hell you were shooting. You could have been shooting ducks in a shooting range for all it mattered. They just kept popping up, and you would eventually, run out of ammo, maybe, but you would probably kill them all and run around looting their corpse and all the goodies they dropped, and that was it. And I didn't really like that. Resident Evil 6, it has a certain elegance to it, but I didn't like how it really focused on a lot of cool things, a lot of stuff that just, in my opinion anyway, didn't really do much for the original core fear and terror of the franchise. And I don't necessarily concur. I'm not of the point of view that Resident Evil was as scary as something like Silent Hill 2. But that's due to the atmosphere that's caused throughout the game. This is something that Dead Space has had to deal with as well. I actually was a real big fan of the original Dead Space, less so 3. I think 1 and 2 were pretty good. 2 slightly worse, slightly inferior in terms of atmosphere, at least in my personal opinion, to the original. But Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and even Code Veronica had a certain elegance towards them, and yes, certain times it was a bit of a pain in the ass to have to store something in the trunk and then realise that, oh crap, I need that item, and have to traipse all the way back. But you know what, I just didn't care at that point. I was enjoying the game, I was enjoying the exploration of it. And when you look at a game like, I don't know, The Last of Us, it's kind of the same there as well. One of the concerns I have with The Last of Us, one of the criticisms, it's not to say that it's not a very good game, I do honestly believe it's one of the best games of this generation, but one criticism I would level at The Last of Us is that things can go south very quickly, which is good, but the problem is sometimes that, at least in my personal opinion, I don't really find ammo, that bad. On the difficulty settings and whatever else, I found that it was actually reasonable. And I found that it was very much like a couple of other games I'd played where you could basically die your way through it. In other words, you could figure out where bad guys were spawning from. Okay, you know what, that sucked. I'm gonna try and restart this all over again because the checkpoints are so lenient. And I know that's just one way you can play. You can choose not to do this, but it's kind of a bit difficult not to if you've just, died once, because naturally you weren't expecting someone to run up behind you with a cricket bat or something. And the second time, of course, you lose so much ammo, you might as well restart anyway, because, well, you screwed up massively. And so that's an issue I've got with Resident Evil, at least in my personal opinion, the earlier titles. You could do stuff like, try to avoid, say, the snake boss in Resident Evil 1. Cliffy B has actually said much the same. He said, and I quote, "Generally speaking, the scarier the game is, the less empowered a player feels. Controls are often clunky on purpose, and the pacing is quite different from an action movie. In the $60 disc-based market, horror doesn't fly, it's the ultimate campaign rental. That's played for 2 days and then traded in, and I'm sure EA knows this. When we're fully digitized, we'll see true horror games coming back." This, of course, was leveled towards Dead Space, and he makes a point. The problem is that when you've got a title and it's got a finite amount of playability, you have a campaign that, say, can be completed in, let's be generous and say 8 hours the first time you're playing the title, then it's going to be traded in, and most people, they don't really want to cough up for a game like that. You've got to remember that titles now are pretty damn expensive to make, and people have to actually be willing to keep the game afterwards, because obviously if they keep it, that means that you can sell downloadable content and whatever else, and more to the point, it actually encourages people to keep the game, because let's say, for example, you've got a game that has like a 20-hour replayable campaign, then that's reasonable. That's something where people are going to come back to and actually want to check it out. Think about it just for a moment. There are several different directions you can go with survival horror. The first is more the route of, say, Amnesia, right? You have no weapons, no nothing, all you can do is hide. That's pretty much it. You avoid the monsters, you hide in a little cupboard, and you pray that the monster doesn't turn you into his bitch. The second option is something more akin to, let's go with Silent Hill 2. In Silent Hill 2, in Silent Hill 2 you have a certain amount of weapons, which have some power behind them, without a question. You have a very finite amount of ammo, and you can take out a certain amount of the monsters. You can decide, I'm going to take this dude out. But when you make that decision, you do so knowing that you have maybe enough bullets in your gun to take out 3 or 4 enemies in a certain location. And you've got to be really certain you want to take those guys out, because if you don't, if you're wasting your bullets, it's not going to go well when you actually fight a boss later on. And then, of course, you've got the Dead Space titles. You've got the Tomb Raider, and you've got the more modern Resident Evils. And those are the more, we're going to give you rocket launchers and plasma cutters and, I don't know, a Swiss Army knife that contains a battalion of soldiers to help fight these creatures, and so you'll have these little scary scenes, but in reality you don't ever feel helpless. I don't actually remember playing Dead Space, say 1 or 3 or Resident Evil 5, for example, and ever thinking to myself, well, I'm screwed. I just didn't. I just felt to myself, okay, I've got enough ammo here, and as long as I'm careful, as long as I'm not just shooting the wall because the wall offends me, and pissing all my ammo up the wall, then, quite literally, then I'm fine. I'm going to be able to continue venturing forth into this game, and worst comes to the worst, I can buy some items to upgrade my power if I so wish, and I really like that aspect actually of Dead Space 3. I did like the fact that you can actually customize your weapons to a degree. Speaking of which, this is another point. One of the really awesome parts of Resident Evil 2, in my opinion, was the weapons. Now, there were multiple weapons, and you couldn't get each weapon with each character. As you all know, Claire had, for example, different weapons from Leon. In my opinion, Leon got the much better end of the stick in terms of the funness of his weapons, but that's just a different personal opinion. I dare anyone to fetch the shotgun with the upgrade, and you have to find each separately, might I add, and believe me when I say that when you get that upgrade of the shotgun, the first time that you use that shotgun on zombies and you just render them all in half, quite literally in half, with the power of this weapon that sounds like I can't even describe the sound. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's this roar of just sheer might, and if you don't have a smile on your face, you're doing it wrong. The same with, for example, the powered-up Magnum. My point being that you've sweated for that. You found that damn weapon, and you worked your ass off. You've been scrimping, you've been saving, you've been literally bleeding. You've had to restart maybe 2 or 3 times on sections. You had to go back a hell of a long way because you were trying to save your ink ribbons. Or maybe you just didn't want to get a crappy rank so you could actually unlock more stuff, in which case you were definitely trying to save your ink ribbons. And so you've scrimped and saved all your ammo, and now you've got a weapon that's actually powerful, and that's survival horror to me. Actually feeling like you've accomplished something, and okay, now you've got a reasonable store of ammunition. You cannot waste it. You cannot just be frivolous and, be using, say, Magnum rounds on a zombie. But what you can do is you can be a bit smart. You can actually group up zombies together and shoot them with the powered up shotgun. And that makes you feel better, and that makes you feel powerful just for a moment, and suddenly, yeah, that powered-up shotgun isn't that great when you're suddenly facing, like, a horde of lickers, or something even worse. And Resident Evil 1, 2, and so on famously had the tank controls, which some people absolutely loved. Well, loved isn't possibly the word I was looking for, but put up with. They didn't mind them, and others, they hated them. It was simple as saying they hated the controls. It was, it was just bad. They didn't like them. The point being, though, that, you know what, we were willing to put up with them because this world actually felt really good. And I felt that Resident Evil 6 onwards, or Resident Evil 6 specifically, it had a lot of good content. It had a lot of really good ideas in it. But the puzzles and the core mechanics in the game were diminished, in my opinion. Resident Evil 4, some people consider it the pinnacle of the survival horror series of Resident Evil. They believe that it was the best all round. It had the most fun controls and so on, and it had a relatively decent upgrade system, but it also had a pretty good story, and some parts were pretty difficult and challenging and still scary. I don't really agree with that 100%. I personally think that the best Resident Evil, and this is my own personal opinion, this is by no means scientifically based or anything like that, and of course you're all free to disagree with me and say, you're wrong, X is better, but I really love Resident Evil Remake, the remake of the original Resident Evil. I just think that the extra additions of the mansion just help really solidify it, and the extra graphics are really lovely as well. I think Resident Evil 2 as well, for completely different reasons. I think the storyline of Resident Evil 2, when you're setting the city, I think if it was done on a remake, if it was done on modern day next generation graphics, I think it would have been incredible. And Resident Evil Code Veronica. I didn't really play Resident Evil 3 that much. I only completed it once, which is pretty awful, if I'm honest, but there you have it. I actually think those games were really good for completely different reasons. I really liked Resident Evil Code Veronica because I felt that it made some really big changes. One thing I did love about Resident Evil 4, however, were the changes in controls, but that's just my personal opinion. And so, I know this has turned into a bit of a whole thing when we were initially talking about Resident Evil, but this is a reality that we have to deal with, that games developers really do need to start picking their battles. And the fact of the matter is that core fans were unhappy with Resident Evil. I'm speaking from the perspective of myself, who was a huge Resident Evil fan, and Spoody Kipper, who is even a larger Resident Evil fan. He was, of course, on the channel as well, and he said himself that, look, the fact of the matter is, you can just melee the enemies at most points, and be honest, if you had the choice between, meleeing something and, well, shooting it, there should be a disparity there. You should be like, okay, I don't want to use the knife. I don't want to be kicking this thing. It should be, okay, I'm out of ammo, or you know what, I'm just going to, start ruffle stomping something because it's it doesn't matter. And that's not to say that the game was easy, that's not to say that you could literally close your eyes and just walk through it. I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that you could tell that they were aiming at a completely different market. And in my personal opinion, I'm glad that they're going to be going this different direction. I'm glad that they're going to be focused more heavily upon, in my opinion, the more core elements of the gameplay. Because you know what? I understand that some people will like the action horror titles. I do as well. I liked Dead Space. I even like, to a slightly distant degree, I don't really put it 100% in the survival action, but somewhat. The Last of Us, I would consider The Last of Us slightly more horror orientated, but whatever. We're splitting hairs at this point. But what I do think is that there should be a core survival horror genre as well, and I think that's what Resident Evil does really well at. I think it makes the storyline a lot stronger and more horrifying. And, you know, I think that if you read the original books, I think the author's name, I believe, is S.D. Perry. It's actually a really good series of books. I would recommend you check them out, actually. I've read, I think there were 6 of them, 5 or 6, I don't remember exactly, but they're a really good series of books. I would recommend them. And you play the original Resident Evils, and you're just reminded how far the series has strayed, if you will, from its original routes. But as I said, they have to pick their budgets, and they will have to, of course, be careful, because they can't make budgets of, like, you know, whatever the Resident Evil 6 budget is, expected to sell as many copies, maybe, because obviously it has to appeal to a certain genre. But there you have it. Anyway, this has been a bit of a ranty video, and hopefully you've enjoyed it anyway. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.